Welcome, everyone. Thanks for joining us today. My name's Tori. I'm from QRA, and I'm going to be moderating our presentation today. We have Marc, Gary, and Jordan with us as well, going to be presenting. So we're very happy to have them with us for combating project risk by addressing ambiguity and uncertainty in scope. So just to kind of kick things off, let me just move through the slide here. I just want to give a quick introduction to the people on our panel. Sorry, let me just I've got my display screen up here, so I need trying to see notes at the same time. With us today, so Marc is our first presenter, and Marc is actually a consultant. Sorry, I got to put back because my note cut off. Marc is a consultant specializing in strategic planning and business development and project management. He graduated from RMC with a Bachelor in Computer Engineering and served in the RNC as a NCS engineer officer. And in 2007, he transitioned to the private sector. In 2007, he originally transitioned to the private sector with progressive project management positions at LM Canada, Blue Drop, Ultra, ISI, and the Dallaire Institute, as well as Jordan, our co-founder and CEO at QRA Corp. He holds a PhD, pseudo cum laude, in quantum theory from the University of Basel, Switzerland, and is also the founding member of the Government of Canada's Advisory Council on AI. And prior to starting QRA, Jordan was a professor and the head of quantum theory, the quantum theory group at Dalhousie University for 14 years. Throughout his career, he's had numerous fundamental contributions to the body of knowledge regarding quantum computing, and it was Jordan's understanding of these quantum computing principles that led him to launch QRA and solve the problem of complex systems verification. And then last, but obviously not least, Gary Cooper is the Deputy Director responsible for cybersecurity procurement at Shared Services Canada. He has been in his current role for almost 4 years and joined SSC in 2014. He's been working in the public sector procurement since 2006. And in May 2019, Gary officially launched SSC's new cybersecurity procurement vehicle. Now in its third year, Gary is continuously and relentlessly seeking innovation and improvements to this agile procurement vehicle. And when he's not logged into work, you can find him at the dog park with his puppy, teaching his daughter to ride a bike, or watching the Toronto Maple Leafs end their Stanley Cup drought. So I think there's a game tonight, isn't there, Gary? Yeah, they're playing the Canadians. So hopefully they do well.
We beat Montreal last night, and we're going to beat Ottawa tonight.
Awesome. Those are all our panelists for today. So just a quick note for the webinar overview. Obviously, Marc's going to start us off, taking us through a primer on risk and impacts to cost. And then we'll pass over to Gary, who will give examples from his experience of ambiguous requirements and their impact, and some stories from the trenches. And then Jordan will go into how technology can and cannot help with some of these examples. And just a little bit of housekeeping too, in regards to any types of questions that we get. We'll answer any questions at the end of the session. If we have time between each speaker, we may address a couple of questions if there's time, but otherwise we'll save them to the end just to keep things flowing. And just so everyone's aware too, obviously the session's being recorded. So, for anyone that you would like to share this with, or you have to duck out early for any particular reason, we will be sending that or circulating that around afterwards, so you can get that. So with that being said, I will pass this over to Marc first and let him start the presentation.
All right, Tori, thanks for that introduction. Good day, everyone. Yeah, so I'm coming to this presentation with the approach of I've committed various mistakes when it came to requirements and estimating against those requirements, and as well as managing risks associated to ambiguous requirements. Whether I was authoring requirements for statement of works or subsystem specifications, or even responding to requests for proposals against end customer requirements. I've made numerous mistakes, so hopefully some of the items I pass along will help. Well, some of you might recognize you've committed the same mistakes. maybe some of you will be able to avoid some of those mistakes. So please do ask questions through the chat panel, and Tori will be monitoring those so that we can address anything as it comes up. For the next slide, just bear with me here. All right, so this is a bit of a primer on project management, the triple constraint. I'm sure everyone's very familiar with this, so I'm not going to spend too much time, but when you're looking at this diagram, for focusing on scope, which is really where the requirements live, a great understanding of those requirements is key. We want to make sure the team executing against the project to deliver on that scope understands them. You also want to make sure the customer understands them as well. Sometimes there's a lot of turnover in the customers, so sometimes you have to re-educate the customer and make sure they understand the context. And sometimes the end user isn't necessarily the customer, so a bit of education on that front can be very important. Not getting that scope correctly understood will definitely impact how budgets are set. You need to estimate for labor, materials, subcontracts to meet that scope. So if you don't fully understand the scope, it's fairly likely your budget estimates will be off. And likewise, schedule can come into play. So if your estimates are off, you might not have had enough time scheduled in the program to meet certain milestones. Additionally, sometimes you do have to plan for unforeseen circumstances such as weather or even pandemics like COVID-19. That definitely had huge impacts to programs as they were executing and had to shift people from a working from home environment. We're still seeing supply chain issues today with chip shortages and getting ports to operate 24 hours a day, shortages in truck drivers and things like that. So there's a lot of supply chain issues compounding a lot of the unforeseen things that have come up due to the pandemic. And then right there in the middle is the quality. So it's definitely something important to consider. When you start a project, that's typically when you have the most budget and schedule, but it's also when you have the most risk. And if you're not proactive in managing that risk near to the end, if you still have a lot of exposure to certain risks, you might not have the budget or schedule to handle them, let alone the resources, because typically you'll start letting your resources go off to other projects. So if you don't manage your risk throughout the project, near the end, that's when you're going to start cutting corners. Maybe you'll do a bit of less testing, or you're going to skip the documentation, or potentially even cut out some functionality if you can get away with it. And that's where perceived quality will definitely take a hit. Any questions, comments on this slide? All right, so no surprise here. Every project comes from risks, and Loesch, DeMeyer, and Piche did a great study a few years ago to talk about project risk and the sources of that risk, primarily coming from uncertainty and ambiguity. And then there's basically three types of categories: the known knowns, or foreseeable uncertainties. These are typically just baked into your estimates. There's always some variability introduced, and one method to deal with that variability is to estimate with the worst case, best case, and most likely case. And that's where you can get into some neat probabilistic Monte Carlo type analysis to come up with, what's the chance what's my 90% chance that I'll hit this budget type of analysis. Then for complexity, or the known unknowns, these are usually things like new features, where some of the requirements might introduce a certain amount of non-recurring engineering, and as well as could be something such as trying to introduce a supply chain to meet offset purposes to make sure you get your in-country content to meet any of those types of requirements. Typically, these are your identified risks, where if a certain condition occurs, it could have a certain impact, and those have to be accounted for. And then finally are the unknown unknowns or unforeseeable uncertainties. So these are the types of things you don't even know that you need to plan for. Typically, a lot of companies will undertake research and development programs to de-risk their technology. So introduce new capabilities, new features through a different pot of money, so that they develop their roadmap and they are ready with a high TRL, low risk solution when a certain requirement comes out from the customer. So how do all of these play into the project costs and ultimately the price? So here on this slide, I've simplified, a formulaic approach, and I'm sure each and every organization applies it in some different manner. But ultimately, your known knowns are part of your estimates. So again, if you ask, for example, Joe for an estimate on software, he's a bit more pessimistic, and typically he comes up with double the hours that Jane would. So there's an example where you might be getting two very different points of view on the same scope of work, and then it's how you want to work that, and that's where a worst case, best case most likely could play in. As well as if you need certain parts ordered, sometimes you need to ask for various quantities to see if there's a price break, but you have to factor that in how you do your estimates. Multi-year programs, typically you do have to do a certain escalation and factor that in. Same thing if your supply chain is made up of out of country suppliers where foreign exchange hedges need to be considered. But those are typically known knowns and can be baked into your estimates. Your identified risks or the known unknowns, these also need to be estimated, but they're factored to a probability. So for example, when I used to work at Ultra, when we came to our PCB designs, we always estimated doing an initial prototype board to a certain amount of risk reduction testing and design verification. And then we always estimated doing a second spin to do the more formal verification and environmental qual testing. And then typically we also included a risk for a potential third spin. And that's just, again, we factor that based on the complexity of the design for the board. Was it something completely new, or was it just an updated design potentially to handle obsolete parts? And then ultimately all these known knowns and identified risks are budgeted for. And that's meant that the project manager is actually intended to spend that budget to either lessen the probability of the risk of occurring, or also potentially addressing the impact should it occur. So basically you could invest in earlier component testing, potentially identify multiple suppliers, etc. And then therefore, when you take your estimated costs, which are your known knowns plus these known unknowns, you end up with your project manager's authorized budget. Next is the management reserve, or contingency as it's also referred to. And this is typically how unknown unknowns are dealt with. It's oftentimes just a blanket percentage of the costs, or potentially even based on historic performance on similar projects of that size and complexity. Sometimes if the requirements are poorly understood and there's a lot of perceived risk or high levels of required NRE, that could also encourage a higher level of management reserve to be put into the bid. Ultimately, this ends up being the total piece of the costs. And on top of that is the margin that gets added on. So you can see that any ambiguity around the requirements could definitely have a direct impact to the price. On the bidder's side, that could lead to a lower probability of win if you come up with a price that is too high. But on the customer side, you could also lead to a higher acquisition cost just due to the ambiguity and the resultant risk premium. So this slide is about requirements and ambiguity. So adequate and well-written requirements are definitely the foundation for selecting solutions that'll meet your expectations. A common problem with requirements is that some of them may be ambiguous, and the way that can cause issues is as the vendor responds to RFPs, they'll always make the assumptions in the interpretation about any ambiguous requirements that is the most favorable to their products. So for example, if the system is to support the need to upload large files, a compliance statement could say, yes, we can handle large files of 5 gigabytes. That's large, therefore we're compliant. But then during implementation, these ambiguous requirements could have led to flawed assumptions. And therefore you could end up with a solution that doesn't actually meet the end user's needs. So in this case, the customer, when they talk about a large file, they're actually thinking 50 gigabytes. And then unfortunately, it's only near the end when some testing is occurring and they're trying to upload 50 gigabyte files and the system crashes, is it discovered that there's this big disconnect. It's probably an oversimplified example, but it definitely drives home the point that something ambiguous introduced in the requirement could lead to an issue like that down the line. Oops, sorry about that. I was really hoping to find a Dilbert cartoon because every slideshow should have a Dilbert cartoon, but I came across this one in my LinkedIn feed in the last little while, and I thought this was a great illustration of how different groups can perceive the same sorts of requirements. They are subject to interpretation, and with missing context or the incorrect context, you can really make an impact on how the requirements are viewed. Ultimately, this speaks to beauty being in the eye of the beholder. So different groups can actually see the same requirements in a different way, and that could end up leading to not actually getting what you need or wanted in the end. So again, as previously stated, a well-written requirement has a single reasonable interpretation in a given context, and that context is definitely part of the requirement. So things to note is, if a context is assumed, but not all readers will know that context, the requirement could be misunderstood. So again, a single reader can interpret a requirement more than one way, and that could again lead to incorrect implementation. Likewise, several readers can actually interpret a requirement very differently from one another. Therefore, when requirement is written at too high a level, for example, the software shall be easy to use, deciding how to prove that and test that could be extremely difficult, and much time could actually be spent trying to better define that requirement into something that's more tangible. Likewise, incompletely written requirements or requirements that are not sufficiently explicit can lead to issues. And finally, poorly structured requirements, such as having unclear antecedents, being written in negative, or using confusing terms or abbreviations could cause issues. So an example for this would be the system shall not permit an upload of an invalid file. So here, shall not is always a difficult case to test. And then what is an invalid file? So restating it differently, such as the system shall accept, doc, docx, txt, and PDF file types would be more tangible to determine. It's actually 4 different file types. You could test for the 4 cases and probably do a 5th exception case to show that the system can handle when you try to upload one of the non-specified file types. So again, just a better way to try to get rid of the ambiguity in your requirements. So in summary, while ambiguities are easy to see in the requirements written by others, they're sometimes difficult to spot in your own writing. So again, someone could easily write something like the system shall have a fast response time. So again, what is a fast response time? So better stated, it would be the system shall respond to user commands in 500 milliseconds or less. Likewise, ambiguities are difficult for writers to see because when they're writing their own requirements, they have a particular context in mind. Sometimes the ambiguity will only become visible when someone else reads the requirement and they don't have that context. And sometimes it's been seen in the past where a writer can actually start recognizing the lack of context or ambiguity when they reread their requirements after a few weeks of time have passed because they may have forgotten the assumed context. So for example, the system shall trigger an automatic logout when a user attempts to download up to 5 times. So again, what is meant by up to 5 times? It's very hard to know if, one is that which falls within up to 5 times is something, should something be done? So again, better stating the requirements such as the system shall trigger an automatic logout after 5 failed download attempts by the user would be much more clear. Therefore, the use of requirements review is sometimes an effective tool for the author to defend a requirement in any lack of context and therefore ambiguity. But sometimes the requirement's actually being reviewed and so much time has elapsed that the author no longer really knows what was the intent of the requirement in the first place. And often these requirements are potentially deleted and left out, and all of a sudden, an opportunity for a much needed capability or feature is lost. So that's kind of my overview on project and risks and ambiguous requirements and how they all play into one another. And at this time, I will pass things off to Gary.
Thanks for that, Mark. We're running a little bit tight for time, but we do have time maybe just one question. Tori can't see the questions because he's in presenter mode, so I will step in and act as moderator. And so we have time maybe for one question here. And let's see. So for Mark, I guess, what are some of the best practices for reviewing and approving requirements that you've seen?
I've actually typically seen it where you get a good group, cross-functional group to basically do a requirements review. So typically everyone's in the room, you're reading the requirement, discussing things like acceptance criteria and potential test cases or testability of the requirement. The downside of that aspect is if everyone then starts to try to wordsmith the requirement, it's better to go with pass fail, and anything that's failed would then get reviewed offline and rewritten, and then another subsequent review would occur. It's very time consuming. It's effective at catching things. I'm trying not to talk too much about QV Scribe, but we've used that in the past to do self checks on the author would basically run QV Scribe to self check requirements they authored, and a lot of stuff can get caught without needing a large group of reviewers, and then they can self correct, and usually the review sessions are much more effective with less likelihood need to go back and rewrite a bunch of requirements. It's usually more of a handful. So kind of a plug there, Jordan, for QV Scribe.
Yeah, I don't mind you talking about QV Scribe at all, but I may have a biased viewpoint. Okay, in the interest of time, we have a few more questions, but I will pass it on to Gary. I will remind everybody that if you do have questions, please put them in the Q&A. If you scroll down to the bottom of your screen, you'll see a little Q&A button there. just click that and enter your question there, and then we'll be able to get to see them and process them. I'm not sure we're gonna be able to get to all of them, but we'll see them. And if we don't do it now, well, maybe we'll send something via email afterwards. And so with that, I will thank you, Mark, and I will pass it on to Gary.
Awesome. Thank you, Jordan. Excellent presentation, Mark. And I appreciate the free consulting and getting some of your expertise, because no matter where we work, public, private sector, requirements are important. And where I sit in the procurement side of the house, it really comes down to the requirements. That's what we're putting out to industry. That's what we're evaluating. That's ultimately, when we award a contract, what we have to live with. So getting the requirements right in my 15 years of public sector procurement, sometimes it happens by accident. Sometimes we have really skilled technical authorities. Sorry, I just have to let my puppy out. Go outside. There you go. Sometimes we have really skilled resources who can write great requirements. And sometimes we just get lucky with a vendor who, as you mentioned in your presentation, Mark, they read the requirements, they interpret it in the best light of their product. They win, they put in a good price, and we get, the best case scenario, we have a great integrator that can make it work. But we've all heard some of the recent National Post type stories for Government of Canada procurement, when we get an integrator or a company who, misinterprets our requirements maliciously, under prices it, prices to win, not to deliver. There's change requests, there's boondoggles, there's billions of dollars that are sometimes wasted. And I think that for myself, cybersecurity in particular, we have to get it right, and it's more important than ever. And I did a little bit of research just to talk quickly about cybersecurity, because it's National Cybersecurity Awareness Month. And Scott Jones, the head of the Canadian Centre of Cybersecurity, actually said in November of this year that we're actually in the middle of two pandemics, not just with personal health and COVID-19, but cybercrime. And, with national states, four big ones known as, China, Russia, North Korea, and Iran, cyber threats are real. And, getting these procurements completed and in place in an agile and incremental manner is what my team is focused on. But that said, we've seen some setbacks recently, and it's been because of requirements. So I do want to quickly just touch on some of these things, and then Jordan can talk about more content, given his background and PhDs. I'm a thorn between a couple of roses here. What we've created here at Shared Services Canada is our cybersecurity procurement vehicle, which essentially is a secure supplier ecosystem of 89 pre-qualified suppliers across Canada, big and small. And we now have the ability to go out to those pre-qualified vetted suppliers to start our procurement process. We're not posting cybersecurity requirements and sensitive information to the public, because we really don't know who's gonna get it. By breaking up the procurement process into steps, we incentivize vendors to basically apply at the start, give us some high-level thought leadership ideas with how we can structure our complex cybersecurity solutions into more executable chunks. We're trying to focus more on outcomes, which is getting away from the prescriptive methodologies of the past, listing a whole bunch of mandatory and rated requirements, trying to prescribe basically how we want the work to be done, not what we need the solution to do, and also adopting the approach of seeing solutions and testing them versus going through, as many have put in place, sometimes binders of bids and the technical evaluation process that can take 6 months and a whole bunch of value sort of wasted, when you could have just seen the solution and got it in place a lot quicker if you had better evaluation approaches. And just trying to be more competitive by having a whole bunch of vendors involved in the procurement process, regardless of size, and allowing those evaluation processes to be progressively shortlisted. So it's not a huge RFP like it used to be. We're breaking up our requirements, throughout the process, which is sounds like it makes sense in theory, but I don't know. Oh, there we go. So this is me drinking from everything I just said. And this horse is a lot of our technical authorities who are are very used to the old way of doing things. And they are very good at writing, very specific technical requirements, or at least so I thought. That was before we got QV Scribe and actually assessed some of the requirements, and I'll talk a little bit about that later. But part of the problem that we have at Shared Services Canada is that we are a common IT service agency. So, we're going out to Department of National Defense, to RCMP, and all our partners, and trying to put in solutions from a cybersecurity perspective that are going to meet all those needs. So whenever you're looking at an enterprise that includes 46 plus departments, and even within our own department, we have project managers, we have technical architects, we have our chief technology branch, and different groups. There's a lot of stakeholders that have a say in the requirements. And obviously, as you can imagine, when you have that many authors, that many reviewers, someone takes a requirement, it gets edited, it gets tweaked. You get in a situation where, a couple of requirements can become 300. And that becomes a bit of an issue when we're evaluating it, and no one can meet all 300. And our legal department tells us that you have to meet all 300 because 299 is not compliant. So that has led to us, despite breaking up the agile procurement methodology, and I'm very proud of what my team has done and the progress we've made, there's still an element of this horse that likes the feeling of prescription, likes the feeling of, making sure we don't miss anything. So I don't want to belabor that point because I think that there's some better examples, but, this is a funny meme that, QRA actually created, and I saw it on LinkedIn, and it's so true because, a functioning product or a cybersecurity solution, which is what we're trying to get to, has been elusive. We have had some wins for sure, but the enterprise complex procurements that have long been challenging continue to be challenges despite our procurement approaches, because of the requirements and because of legacy thinking in terms of prescription and the safety blanket of just dictating the architecture versus the outcomes. And I know this is similar, I think, to one of Marc's slides, but this is something that on the procurement side, we really, in what we've seen, our project managers, they want these solutions done quickly, and they want them done, within a certain amount of budget. So there's a dollar value associated, which we can't really do without sacrificing quality. And obviously on the technical side of the house, they want the best quality, and they don't necessarily care so much about cost because it has to work. And if we do it fast, that's great, but quality sort of trumps all. And we're trying to hit this sort of gray zone in the middle, which is obviously elusive. So my focus going forward now is let's do it right, and let's do it at a good price for the taxpayer. And if it takes more time, we're trying to manage expectations with our project management branch, because the schedule and the calendar should not dictate the quality of our requirements, because we need to take more time to use tools like QV Scribe, do more collaboration with our industry partners, and really get it right, because cybersecurity, as I said, is very important. And this is just sort of how it's felt within Shared Services Canada on the procurement side of the house for the last couple of months, because, as I said, we can change the procurement process, but when we send out complex requirements that are poorly written or poorly defined in terms of what we expect vendors to provide, and we evaluate for 6 months and no one meets all our mandatory requirements, you kind of have to go back to the drawing board, like my beloved Toronto Maple Leafs are, and learn from your failures and really get back at it, because it's okay that if you didn't get it right one time, but we can't allow our technical teams to just keep writing mandatories and rateds and expect a better outcome. We need to train them. We need to give them tools like QV Scribe so they can understand that while they're writing their requirements, there's quality, because by the time they submit it to us in procurement and we run it through the tool and they score a 2 out of 5, and they basically, for lack of a better term, tell us to fuck off, like, this is what you're putting out there. We fought with them about it. We put it out there, and now everyone failed. So tools are great, but it's the change management of people. And that's what we're dealing with. And maybe a few more licenses of QB Scribe and more knowledge of how we can use the technology will help us get there. This is just a quick sample of one of our requirements and what would score a 1 out of 5. So as you can see, looking at all these things, the universal qualifiers, the open-ended optional end clauses, excessive continuances, the ands and all these different terms, the reports are great, and we can sort all the ones and we can address them, ideally before things go out. And we're continuing to use this. SRAM, or Secure Remote Access Migration Procurement, as an example, was one that we were able to bring people along, and was one of the early adopters of the tool. And we just finished our proof of solution phase. We have two great options that we're going to be evaluating from a financial perspective. So there is good news stories out there, but there is other ones where the requirements are not quite aligned with what the scoring methodologies that we have. Here's another one. I don't need to belabor this. I want to save some time for Jordan, but it just goes to show, this is a very complex requirement, and you can just see all the different elements and all the different terms and quantifiers and things that the tool catches that are really helping us. But again, we need to train our people better so they're using the tool earlier on, and it's not just us running the report in procurement and us timelines dictating that we have to just put it out anyway, or with minor corrections. So this is basically where we're at in Shared Services Canada with our cybersecurity procurement. And success is not final, failure is not fatal. It is the courage to continue that counts, and that's really where we're at, in trying to continue to improve and minimize the amount of mandatory requirements where we can. Let industry propose solutions. We obviously have to evaluate in a fair, open, and transparent manner. We have taxpayer dollars. We have Government of Canada trade agreements and regulations that sort of dictate, how we do things. But that said, better requirements are going to lead to better outcomes, and that is still our main goal. And where we're at today, we're using technologies, we're using whatever we can to get to that end state that we know we can get to. We've had some setbacks, but we're continuing to work on it. Awesome. I'll pass it over to Dr. Jordan, and I'll answer any questions at the end if there's time.
Dr. Jordan, I like that. There is one question for you, Gary. So maybe if you can come back on. And the question is, I've heard in engineering up to half of design flaws originate in the requirements. Can you speak to the analogous metric in procurement?
That's a good one. I think that, as much as we can, I would agree with that statement. I think in our procurement processes as a whole, we try to, as our legal department tells us, we have to tell industry and our different vendor community, exactly how we're going to be evaluating, exactly how we're going to be running the process. And then we follow the process, as we outline. So that's where the requirements in the case that we had over 300 mandatories, and no one met all of them. And we said that in our process that, he had to meet all 300. So despite some of our senior executives saying, well, just get rid of some of these ones, and well, we couldn't do that because we said what we were going to be doing on the procurement side. We couldn't adapt the requirements once they've been released to industry, because that's not how the Government of Canada operates. We're still looking at different procurement approaches that allow us to maybe right the ship once it's sort of left port, but we're looking at what we can do there within my side of the house. But better requirements and less of them is ultimately what I'm seeing, and with recent lesson learned, those setbacks we've had is going to get us to where we need to go faster.
Good, thank you, Gary. And I think I am now in control of the presentation, I believe. Yes, I am. There it is. All right. Give me a second here. I'm giving you guys a preview of my presentation. All right. I guess I'll start with this one. So thank you both, Mark and Gary, for that presentation. It was very informative, and they were both kind of used from the trenches, from the practitioners, one from let's say the engineering and fulfillment and project execution stage, and one from the procurement stage. And we see there's problems on both sides. What I want to talk now for the remainder of the time, we've got about 15 minutes left, so I'll try to be cognizant of our time, is talk about the role of technology and the role of the tool makers. I won't talk about so much about the tool makers, but the role of technology is, I would think, more important for this audience, especially to describe what technology can do and what technology cannot do, because it doesn't have all the answers. Like, we're not going to change people's minds through technology. And we've seen also in a lot of our customers, the way they use technologies can actually make it worse, right? So technology is not a salve that will solve all your problems. It's not a magic pill. If used poorly, it can actually make things worse, not better. So the key thing is to use it properly. And if it is used well, it does become a force multiplier with really compounding benefits, especially if requirements. If you use technology correctly on the requirement stage, you cannot eliminate the human. There's a role for the humans to play, a very important role, a very critical role for the human to play, without any question whatsoever. But especially if you use technology wisely in the requirement stage, you'll find compounding benefits later on in the project as well. And so I want to take a little bit of what technology can't do. This may be obvious for some, but not for everyone. We have, even some of our customers expect our technology to do these things for them, and we are sorry to disappoint them. And we also see some people who think vendors are advocating technology to use this, and AI is a perfect culprit here that's going to solve all our problems, right? So if any vendor tells you they can do these things, it's actually wrong. It's not possible to do things, right? So technology cannot replace human thought, right? And they cannot think for you. They cannot divine what you intend to do, because your intentions are in your mind. The purpose of requirement is to get your intent down on paper. And all technology can do is just see what's on paper and advise you. It cannot decide for you what to build, or what you intend to build, right? That is the role of the human actor. And the problem with many requirements today is that there's so much time on drudgery that the people involved, oftentimes senior engineers, don't have enough time to do these important things that they ought to do, because they're doing other stuff that technology can do. And that is really the key thing here. And so if we talk about what it can do, I would say the first one is probably the most important one from my point of view, is to alleviate the drudgery of low value work performed by high value engineers. That is one of the key things. We had a question earlier that Marc answered about how to do, best practices for requirements review. And, he mentioned that you get them in a room, you discuss the requirements, and you go through them. And so these people who are, first of all, these types of meetings are very expensive. They're often many, many days. And for the person to review and approve the requirements, you really need your most experienced engineers, because they're the ones who decide, yes, this is the right thing to do. Yes, it actually captures our intent. So a lot of it is low value drudgery work, because if the requirements are poorly written, you end up spending time talking about, parsing the requirements. What does the requirement mean? What do they actually, so you end up not spending enough time at the higher level of talking about the strategic thing, and is this the right requirement, instead of you spend time talking about what is the requirement actually trying to tell you. And that is just really a waste. And another thing is lots of corporations have rules or standards, and they want this to apply the rules the same way every time, everywhere, and always. And that's something that is very difficult for humans to do. If you have a stack of requirements that are 500 requirements, and you sit down with the highlighter, the first couple ones you do well, by the time you're down to requirement number 254, your eyes are like tearing up and you're seeing double. It's tough to have that level of stamina for that level of work, where for a machine, it's fairly simple, right? And it cannot think for you, but it can uncover potential problems and show you areas where you may want to look at contradictions, right? And clarity. The bottom line is, what you really want to do is increase the clarity of your requirements so they can be interpreted only one way, and it's obvious that it's one way. This is not the time for nice, colorful prose and speaking in idioms, but very, very clear and forthright, and be consistent and decrease contradictions, right? A lot of requirements that exist, especially for big projects, have requirements that contradict each other. So it's actually not possible to fulfill all the requirements, right? And so you get things that people being not 100% compliant because in some cases, it's just not possible to be 100% compliant because you have contradictions in your requirements. So here is, like, I think a really good example, right? Good old Alan Greenspan, who is a heavyweight in his field. I know you think you understand what you thought I said, but I'm not sure you realize that what you heard is not what I meant. Now, Alan Greenspan generally knows what he's talking about. Whether you agree with him or not is a separate matter, but he's generally knowledgeable. This statement is actually correct. It makes sense, but you need time to actually parse it, to understand where the commas are, put imaginary brackets between all the pieces, and then you put it together and you say, yeah, okay, I get what he's saying. It makes sense. This would be a perfect example of a very poor requirement, very unclear, because imagine now someone reads this, English is not their first language. It's being read by like many people down the line. Some of them do not have time to spend parsing this time. And you can see how, other lower level requirements may be written from a higher level requirements. And you see this compounding. Broken telephone starts spiraling out of control. And 5 years later, you realize that the original requirement was actually misinterpreted. So technology can't help with something like this and say, come on, Alan, you can do better than this, improve it, right? So some of the things that technology can do is to automatically identify problematic constructs through what we call syntactic encoding, right? This is at the down machine level, right? And so QVScribe is a tool that we've built. I don't want this to become a sales pitch for QVScribe, but there are other tools as well that do this type of technology, right? But these things like missing directives, missing imperatives, vague phrases, open-ended clauses, non-specific temporal phrases are very common. These are all types of things that are well understood in the NLP circles. Very recently, the technology has improved to a stage that this can actually be ready and useful in production environments. And these can be detected very, very quickly and surfaced immediately. And so this is something that is not going to solve all your problems, but these types of problems that oftentimes, if you don't use the technology, requires a human to go through and read it, can be alleviated because a computer can do some of that much better and quicker and consistently across the board. So one example of how this can be used is, most of the people listening are familiar with encosi. It's this international body for systems engineering. They have a very well-known guide for writing requirements. There's many other guides, but this is one probably the most used. And in there, they offer details and what makes a good requirements, particularly for systems engineering or engineering in general. And it's basically prose. It's a little booklet you can read, and if you follow what they say, you'll write better requirements. And these are some of the things that they say you should have, these characteristics of or rules for good requirements. Now we have several of our customers take these rules and they want to adhere to these rules. But the problem is that you can violate each of these rules in 100 different ways. So by the time you look at the standards document that makes it practical in practice with some of these engineering firms, these guidelines end up looking something like this. So it's a huge mess. It's lots of little footnotes here and there, lots of exceptions. It's often relies on humans to go through and make sure these rules are met. So they can't read all the requirements. Maybe they take a subset and mark those, and they try to do, we'll call it manual Monte Carlo. Marc mentioned Monte Carlo simulation in the beginning. You can't do that. So you have to do that because there's just too many requirements here to do. But it's generally a manual process. And you can see how things can go wrong. But using some of the technology, you can automate a lot of this, not all of it. It's important to say it's not a magic bullet, but through the use of technology, you can automate much of this. So for example, in QVScribe, we can automate about 75% of the encosi rules. They can be automated. Sometimes they can be augmented by quality indicators and analysis categories. And so not everything has to be done manually. Not everything has to be done by your most experienced engineer. Some of it can be automated away, but you still need the review. So if technology is used properly, The review meetings still occur, but they occur in a much shorter period of time, and the level of discourse in these meetings is at a much higher strategic level of what it is you actually want to build. And the goal is really to help people, right? And so good technology is enabling. It's not a replacement of people. It enables them to do more. So there are some things that the professional can do, and there are some things that a tool can do. And it's really getting this balance right that makes technology work for the enterprise. Another thing that technology can do are things like consistency and similarity. A lot of times we look at documents that they don't have units or term consistency. By term consistency, I mean you call the same thing by the same term every time, right? If you're talking about a car, you don't call it a car once and a vehicle once and a lunar rover the next time. You call it the same thing every time, right? Or if you have a driver, it's not a driver one time and a user another time. Another one is similarity, right? So similar requirements are often contradictory requirements. Contradictory requirements are obviously very bad because they are logically impossible to satisfy both, so they have to be fixed. But even requirements that are equivalent are also bad because it introduces redundancy. Then if you talk to change management, requirements always change. You have to change it in more than one place, and that makes it more chances for error to seep into the project at a very early stage. And so something like technology can help uncover these earlier on while the engineer is actually writing the requirements. I will so QVScribe does about these. I don't want to talk too much about QVScribe, but you've heard it mentioned in this seminar a fair bit, or this webinar a fair bit. I will leave it. If people want information, they can reach out to us, and we'll be happy to give them the demo. I do want to add end talking maybe a little bit of a philosophical note as a tool maker. And we've experienced firsthand a lot of the things that Marc mentioned, a lot of the resistance to change that Gary mentioned, and I tell my team that some of these things are not our fault, but they are our problem. As a tool maker, they're useful only if they are actually used. If we build a tool that solves everybody's problem, but no one uses it, then it's kind of a worthless tool, right? They have to actually be used. So that's extremely important. And it's better if people want to use your tool rather than people have to use it. And so there are some tools that are pushed down from the top that people use it because they're told to use it. That's fine. But if people want to use your tool, if it actually makes their own lives better, it's more likely that they will actually use it. And that's something as a tool maker we have to keep in mind. Whether it's for consumers or for the enterprise, in the end, it's people that do the work. And so what we do as tool makers, we have to have empathy for the user and really understand that everyone's just trying to solve a problem. The tool should be there to help you, not to replace you or even to make your life more difficult. And with that, I will end. And I will pass it back on to Tori. I don't know, we've used almost a whole hour, so I don't know if we have any more time, but Tori, if you're there, you can come back on and we'll take it from there.
Awesome. Thanks, Jordan. Yeah, how are we for time? We have a couple of minutes, so if we want, we can maybe answer a question or two. And if you do have questions, don't be afraid to ask them as well. If we can't, obviously we're not gonna have enough time to get to them, but we're happy to answer them after the fact as well. We can circulate those around to the panelists where required. I know that Jordan, there's a couple, or I saw a couple questions here. Maybe you can answer these quickly. The question is, I saw the term ears conformance in the list of encosi rules. Can you expand on what that is?
Ears, yes. So ears is not officially part of encosi. It stands for the help me out here, Tori. Easy authoring of requirement syntax. I believe that's what it's called. EARS. Easy authoring of requirement syntax. That's right. It's a kind of template that Alistair Maven, formerly of Rolls-Royce, came up with. It's used in the industry a fair bit. it's a series of templates that describe all the types of requirements you have, whether a requirement is ubiquitous or whether it is conditional on some event, whether it's event driven, whether it depends on some feature being present in the product. They went and they looked and they broke things down to 7 categories of requirements, and they formed a template of all of those, right? And there's pros and cons about that. The pros of that is that all your requirements start to look similar. They have a certain pattern, and pattern recognition helps in that way. So, and especially for users, maybe English isn't their first language, this helps them to have clear, consistent requirement. But even if English is your first language, it still is very useful because your requirements have a very uniform look and a uniform feel to them. So it's when something's missing, it's easy to spot. And the downside would be maybe that it's a bit too stilted. You don't have the full expression of English prose. One of the reasons why, the world's information is largely encoded in text. The reason is that text is so expressive. You can express concepts in that. So when you restrict it to a template, you restrict that level of expression, but you also decrease the errors. So it's, so for many people, ears works fantastic. Right.
And then it looks like there's a follow-up question to that. It says, just curious to see if anyone's kind of used, I guess, ears to apply to the RFP process or how it might be applied.
Well, the ears wouldn't be applied to the RFP process itself. It's a way of writing requirements. So if your RFP has some RFPs could have a stipulation that the technical requirements in the RFP should be submitted in ears, and we're going to check it against the ear standards. It could be something like that. If people write it in ears as a response to an RFP, ears are specifically for technical requirements, and RFP are not only technical requirements, of course, they have other pieces of it too. But responding to an RFP with ears could be beneficial as well. I'm not sure if that actually answers the question that was asked or not.
Sure, we know we're at the top of the hour anyway. So if we want to expand on that question, we can reach out to the person that asked it and then expand on it for them. Yeah, that's awesome. That takes up all of our time. We're right at the top of the hour, so I don't want to keep people because I'm sure they have things to jump to. But thank you everyone for joining us today and listening to the session. Thanks to Marc, Gary, and Jordan for taking the hour of their day to come and participate in this with us. And again, if anyone has any questions in regards to any of the material covered, feel free to reach out to us. We will send the recording around tomorrow. And I did see a question in regards to the presentation as well, getting the slides. So happy to circulate that as well. Yeah, enjoy the rest of your day and have a great weekend, everyone.
Thank you. Goodbye, everyone. Thank you for joining.
Thank you, everyone.
Thanks.
Thank you very much. Bye.